Good morning. This is Shepard Miller. This is lesson plan one over Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca. This is ELPS, some lesson vocabulary that we'll be talking about in the lesson that the students should have an understanding of by the end of it. Explorer, expedition, survival, adaptation, and indigenous. These are my language objectives: listening, 2C, speaking, 3D, reading, 4F, and writing, 5B. Learning objective. After the lesson, fourth grade social studies students will analyze the survival challenges faced by Cabeza de Vaca by participating in a survival simulation and will complete a worksheet with 80% accuracy. Some modification or differentiation that I can use for ELL students or emergent bilinguals. I can provide sentence stems on the worksheet. And for SPED or 504s, they can have verbal responses instead of only written ones. So, good morning, class. This is Shepard Miller, Mr. Miller. And over the last few lessons, we've been talking about Texas exploration and colonization. And today we're going to continue that trend and talk about an extremely influential man in the exploration and colonization of Texas. And we're going to learn a little bit about his journey and about his story. It is a pretty fascinating and magnificent one. So over the next couple of lessons, we will be talking about Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca. So today, we will discuss Cabeza de Vaca and some of his journey, some of his struggles, and some of the expedition that originally brought him to the Americas. We will participate in a survival simulation, and for independent practice, there will be a worksheet to do at the end. So, Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca, he was born in Spain. He was an explorer, a treasurer, a trader, a healer, and a survivor, most importantly. He's a magnificent man. He did a lot in the just under a decade that he was in Texas and in the Americas, and he endured so much hardship, but he pushed through, he survived, he adapted, and he was a pretty magnificent individual. So, Cabeza de Vaca, he was the treasurer of the Narvaez expedition. The Narvaez expedition we'll talk about in a little bit. It was an expedition from Spain to colonize the Americas. He was the second in command of this expedition, and the reason we know so much about Cabeza de Vaca and the reason we can tell his story and the stories of the other people that he encountered was because he wrote everything down afterwards. It's called La Relación. It's in Spanish, but there are English translations of it. So if you're an English native speaker and you want to read it in English, there's free access to it through Texas State, and you can go right to the primary source through a translation right there. So that's pretty awesome that they can do that. So the Narvaez expedition of 1527, it was failed from the start. It was doomed from the start, we could say. The point of the Narvaez expedition was to establish Spanish colonial control in what we know today as Florida. The land of flowers is what Florida means in Spanish. So you can just hear the land of flowers. The people in Spain hear that and they think this beautiful, this magnificent, incredible area, and it is beautiful. We can see that even today. Panfilo de Narvaez was the command. He was the first in command of the expedition. He was a strange man. He was very smart. He was indeed very smart, but he was very arrogant, very proud, and very spiteful. He only had one eye. He was the one-eye expeditioner. There's something kind of funny with him. He had one eye. He lost it in a fight while in one of the first times he was in the Americas, in South America. So the Narvaez expedition leaves Spain in 1527 with the intent to establish a Spanish settlement in Florida. And they left with 5 ships and over 300 men. En route, they run into a hurricane over here in the Gulf of Mexico. And so they have to stop in Cuba and wait out and restock and resupply there. So they don't actually head to Florida until 1528. But you can see right here the route. They come from Spain to what is today to San Domingo in what is today the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And then they get caught in a hurricane and they have to go to Cuba right here before they continue on their way to Florida. And they will eventually make landing in what is present day Tampa Bay, Florida. And they will endure some crazy things there. So Narvaez, he gets to Florida, and he has what have we been talking about in this class? We've been talking about the motivations of Spanish explorers, of colonialist explorers in the colonization period. And their motivations were God, gold, and glory, right? And Narvaez was no different. He was familiar with the great riches in the Southern Americas, the South Americas, the riches that came with the conquistadors and the colonization of the South Americas, and it was vast. So this expedition, he was expecting to be glorified in a way. He was expecting to become rich, and as we know with historical hindsight, that there was no gold, there was no riches, there were no great societies in the North American continent at the time. Just various confederations of indigenous tribes, and groups of people in that sense. So they get to continental Florida, and Florida is a swamp, crazy, and they can't survive. They're starving. They're fumbling around. Native Americans are following them around, but they never let them get close enough to talk or discuss. And Narvaez he's almost against trading or having a communication with the Indians. He feels that the Indians. He feels that he's too high and mighty. He is an aristocrat of Spain. He's too high to stoop down and ask the indigenous peoples of the area for help. So just the leadership of Narvaez just dooms the expedition from the beginning. So Narvaez, after they make landfall and they lose their ships, they're fumbling around inland for a while, and Narvaez orders them to build rafts. And Narvaez, actually being the high and mighty, spiteful man that he was, he picked and selected the strongest and most healthy men that were left on the expedition to be on his raft. And so there were 3 or 4 rafts that were floating around the coast in the Gulf of Mexico for about 6 weeks. They endured storms, starvation, and dehydration. So this is the Cabeza de Vaca's route. We'll talk a little bit later about his inland journeys, or in the next lesson, we'll talk about his inland journeys and kind of what happens in there in that experience. But this is Cabeza de Vaca's route. So they come in, the Narvaez expedition, hurricane returns them to Cuba. They go on their way in 1528. They make land in what is Tampa Bay, Florida. And they move up and down Florida, fumble around, don't know what to do, try to find food, try to talk to indigenous peoples, but they don't have luck. They die, they get picked off, they starve. They build these rafts and they float along the Gulf. And they're floating along the coastline. And many of the rafts get lost, and we have no idea. Historians have no idea what happened to them. And eventually, a Cabeza de Vaca and his group, their raft makes land on a little island off of Galveston, and that is where the Texas adventure of Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca begins. It begins on Galveston Island, and there he will learn survival techniques. He will be enslaved to an indigenous people group called the Kronquas. But they will also save his life. And there's a number of stories and things that are just miraculous in the story of Cabeza, Vaca, and we will go over that in the next time. So on to the survival simulation. So there will be 3 scenarios. Scenario 1, your group has been wandering for days, your food supply is gone, and you're thirsty. The land is dry and you don't know where the next source of water is. So what will you do? There will be 3 options to scenario 1, and your group will decide the best scenario. And then you will discuss and explain your scenario and your answer to the other groups after the completion of this. Scenario 2, your group is lost in a new place. The land looks different and you don't know where to go. There's smoke in the distance, which might mean people, but you don't know if they're friendly. What will you do? And scenario 3, a strong storm is coming and you and your group need to find shelter fast, but there are no houses or buildings and the wind is getting stronger. What will you do? Now, the point of this survival simulation is to get us in the mindset, get us in the shoes of Cabeza de Vaca in learning how to survive and to adapt to this rugged, unfamiliar, unforgiving country terrain that is Texas. And so we will get our mindsets into that, and then we can, and then following the scenarios, there will be a written reflection on a worksheet. And then in our next lesson, we can kind of compare our scenarios to that of what Cabeza de Vaca actually experienced and actually did on his journey. So right here, this is the independent practice worksheet. You will briefly summarize your scenario. So what was your survival challenge? Write it right here, scenario 1, 2, or 3. Write it out. Which option did your group choose and why? Make sure to explain it. 2 to 3 sentences, complete sentences. What are the risks of your choice? Because there's not a perfect answer in these. So there's pros and cons to each. There's risk and reward to each. So make sure you explain those. And what might Cabeza de Vaca have done in this situation? Write a brief response of what you believe he would do, what you think he might do. And that'll be the independent practice for today. So work together, make sure you be respectful and you participate well. And then these are some sources. Thank y'all so much. Y'all have fun in your simulation.